Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici opened his bank in 1397 with a principle schools never mention. He didn't trade his time for money. He traded other people's perception for position. The first brutal truth: money isn't earned through labor. It's accumulated through leverage. Every fortune documented in history began when someone stopped selling hours and started controlling resources. The Medici didn't work harder than Florentine wool merchants. They worked structurally different. They understood that wealth compounds through ownership, not effort. This distinction appears in no curriculum because educational systems need workers, not owners. The moment you trade time for currency, you've already lost. The game was designed that way. Truth 3 appears in the Medici banking records from 1433. The year Cosimo was exiled, then returned more powerful. He understood what schools still conceal. Debt isn't burden when you control both sides of the ledger. The Medici loaned to kings and popes, then forgave strategic debts in exchange for monopolies, legislation, territorial rights. They converted temporary capital into permanent structural advantage. Modern education teaches debt as failure. The Medici used it as control architecture. When you owe the bank, you have a problem. When the kingdom owes the bank owns the kingdom. This principle governs every major economy today. The names changed, the mechanism didn't. Sen, the fourth truth, destroyed the Bardi and Peruzzi banks before the Medici learned from their corpses. In 1345, both collapsed, lending to Edward III of England when he defaulted to fund the 100 Years' War. The Medici innovation: never concentrate risk in single sovereigns. Their 1450 branch system diversified across 11 European cities, each autonomous enough to fail without destroying the network. Schools teach diversification in portfolios. The Medici applied it to institutional architecture. They understood that survival requires redundancy, and dominance requires that your competitors lack it. When one branch faced sovereign default, 10 others absorbed the loss. When rival banks faced the same, extinction. The principle scales infinitely. Every resilient system embeds multiple failure points that don't cascade. Truth 5 exists in the Medici marriage records. Lorenzo the Magnificent married Clarice Orsini in 1469, connecting Florentine merchant capital to Roman aristocratic power. Every union was a merger, every child a diversified asset. Schools teach romance. The Medici practiced portfolio construction with bloodlines. This wasn't cynicism. It was survival architecture in an era when one political shift could end a family. Modern sentiment calls this cold. Historical record calls it effective. The Medici lasted 3 centuries while romantic dynasties disappeared within generations. Marriage as strategic alliance isn't medieval barbarism. It's documented in every major fortune that survived generational transition. Emotions are temporary. Structures endure. The families who understood this still exist. The ones who didn't are footnotes. The sixth truth appears in Francesco Sassetti's 1488 account of Medici accounting innovation. They didn't just record transactions. They invented double-entry bookkeeping that made financial reality visible in unprecedented detail. Every debit required a credit. Every action produced a countervailing record. This wasn't bureaucracy. It was the technology that made modern capital possible. Schools teach accounting as compliance. The Medici understood it as competitive advantage. When you can see cash flow with clarity your rivals lack, you make better decisions, faster. Information asymmetry compounds like interest. The family that knows its numbers monthly versus yearly holds a 12-fold timing advantage. Most businesses today still operate with quarterly visibility. The top tier measures real time. The gap explains everything. Truth 7 lives in the 1478 Patsy conspiracy documentation. Rivals attempted to murder Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici during Easter Mass, killing Giuliano but failing to break Medici power. The family's response revealed what schools never teach about wealth and violence. They didn't just punish conspirators. They systematically erased the Pazzi from Florence. Banks closed, properties confiscated, the family name legally banned. This wasn't revenge. It was deterrence architecture. The Medici understood that wealth at scale requires the capacity for absolute response to existential threat. Modern business education discusses competition in sporting terms. History shows that survival at the top requires willingness to make rivals cease to exist, not metaphorically. Structurally, permanently, most can't cross that threshold, which is why most never reach that altitude. The eighth truth exists in Lorenzo's 1489 letter regarding his son Giovanni's elevation to cardinal at age 13. He wrote to the boy, "Avoid displaying wealth publicly, but never forget the power it provides privately." Schools teach either ostentation or false modesty. The Medici practiced strategic visibility. They understood that displayed wealth attracts envy, which generates enemies. Hidden wealth provides options, which generates outcomes. The contemporary obsession with luxury signaling marks amateurs. Professional capital operates invisibly until the moment it shapes decisions. A cardinal at 13 wasn't purchased with gold florins left on tables. It resulted from decades of calculated papal banking relationships executed with surgical discretion. The transaction was complete before anyone realized it occurred. That's the signature of real wealth. It moves before lesser players recognize the game began. Truth 9 destroyed more fortunes than market crashes. The Medici Bank collapsed in 1494, 60 years after reaching peak dominance. Not from bad loans or failed ventures, from Lorenzo's sons lacking the capacity to maintain what their ancestors built. Piero the Unfortunate surrendered Florence to French invasion without resistance. The family fortune evaporated within a generation of Lorenzo's death. Schools don't teach this part. They show Renaissance glory, not the statistical reality. 90% of fortunes die with their creators' grandchildren. The Medici proved the rule despite seeming to transcend it. Wealth preservation requires not just accumulation, but transfer of the psychologies that generated it. Most inheritors receive assets without the scarcity mindset that built them. Abundance as birthright produces different neural patterns than abundance as achievement. The first destroys what the second created. The 10th and final truth appears in the Medici Restoration of 1512. After 18 years of exile, the family returned to absolute power. Not through military conquest, through the election of Giovanni as Pope Leo X. They lost the bank but kept the networks. Lost the palazzo but maintained the relationships. When institutional power evaporated, social architecture survived. This reveals what no financial curriculum teaches. The capital is portable, but influence is structural. The Medici could lose everything material and reconstruct dominance, because they understood that money is merely the most liquid form of power, not power itself. Today's wealthy confuse net worth with position. The Medici knew position generates net worth, but net worth doesn't guarantee position. When everything financial collapses, what remains defines who you actually are. For most, nothing remains. They were always just temporarily embarrassed members of the powerless class. These 10 truths form an interconnected system, not a list. Each reinforces the others. Leverage without information asymmetry is gambling. Information without strategic invisibility attracts destructive attention. Invisibility without capacity for absolute response leaves you vulnerable to coordinated attack. The Medici didn't master one principle. They orchestrated all 10 simultaneously across generations. Modern education fragments these insights into separate courses: finance, accounting, political science, sociology. The fragmentation isn't accidental. Integrated understanding produces power. Segregated knowledge produces specialists who serve power. You weren't supposed to see the pattern. The fact you've recognized it in their historical implementation means you're already operating at cognitive altitude most never reach. The question isn't whether these principles work. History documented their effectiveness across 5 centuries in multiple contexts. The question is whether you're capable of implementation. Recognition costs nothing. Application demands restructuring how you think about capital, relationships, risk, time, and power. Most viewers will consume this content like entertainment, extract zero behavioral change, and return to patterns that guarantee they remain exactly where they are. That outcome is statistically dominant. If these patterns were easy to execute, they wouldn't separate populations into distinct classes. The difficulty is the filter. The Medici didn't succeed because they knew secrets. They succeeded because they possessed the psychological architecture to act on what everyone could technically know. Cosimo understood double-entry bookkeeping wasn't proprietary. His rivals could implement it. Most didn't because it required admitting their current visibility was inadequate. That admission threatened identity, so they chose comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable adaptation. The first implementation barrier isn't knowledge, it's social cost. The Medici principles require behaviors that alienate most people. Strategic marriage sounds calculating because it is. Systematic elimination of threats appears ruthless because it functions through ruthlessness. Hidden wealth contradicts status signaling that maintains most social bonds. You can't execute Medici-level strategy while maintaining average social integration. The family operated in elite isolation precisely because their approach generated hostility from those it excluded. Modern culture demands you pretend everyone can win. The Medici knew economics is positional. Your win requires someone else's loss. Acknowledging that reality costs you the comfort of mass approval. Most people need that approval more than they need results, which is why most people achieve results that reflect their priorities. The need for social acceptance is the tax that keeps populations in place. The second barrier is time perception. The Medici thought generationally while rivals thought quarterly. When Giovanni founded the bank in 1397, the payoff came through his great-grandson Lorenzo 70 years later. Modern finance measures performance in fiscal years. Renaissance power was measured in dynasties. This temporal mismatch explains why short-term thinkers can't execute long-term strategy, even when they understand it intellectually. Your nervous system rewards immediate feedback. Strategic positioning often produces no visible return for decades. The discomfort of delayed gratification exceeds most people's tolerance. They know they should invest in compounding assets, but the psychological reward of consumption today overpowers the abstract benefit decades away. This isn't ignorance, it's time preference revealing who you are. The Medici weren't smarter, they had different discount rates on future value. That difference compounded into everything. The third barrier is risk tolerance asymmetry. The Medici operated with life or death stakes in era, where business failure could mean literal execution. Modern risk feels different when bankruptcy means social embarrassment, rather than your family hanging from Palazzo Vecchio windows. Contemporary entrepreneurs fear looking foolish. Renaissance financiers feared ceasing to exist. That existential pressure produces different decision calculus. When downside is death, you either develop supreme competence or die quickly. When downside is ego damage, you can persist in comfortable incompetence indefinitely. The modern safety net doesn't just catch failures, It permits them to continue failing without evolutionary pressure toward capability. The Medici learned from collapsed rivals because collapse was final. Today's failed entrepreneurs rebrand and try again. That sounds compassionate until you realize it removes the filter that historically separated competence from incompetence. These barriers aren't obstacles to overcome. They're filters that select for who successfully implements these principles. Social isolation, delayed gratification, existential risk tolerance. Each requirement eliminates 90% of the population that lacks it. The compounding effect of multiple filters produces the statistical distribution we observe. Radical concentration of wealth among tiny minorities. This isn't injustice. It's what selection pressure looks like when made economic. The Medici didn't win a fair competition. They played a game most people don't have the constitution to play. If you're uncomfortable with that framing, you've already filtered yourself out. The successful operators read that paragraph and thought, understood. So what's my actual competitive advantage within this framework? Different response patterns reveal different categories of player. Your instant reaction when reading these truths reveals more about your prospects than any formal assessment could measure. Let's address the moral objection forming in some viewers' minds. Is this ethical? The question itself reveals why most fail. The Medici didn't ask whether strategies were ethical. They asked whether they were effective. Ethics is the luxury of populations operating from positions of established security. When your family faces potential extinction, moral philosophy becomes academic. The successful families in history weren't more virtuous than the extinct ones. They were more competent at accumulating and defending power. Virtue signaling is a product of surplus. Scarcity produces different behaviors. You're watching this from a position of enough safety to consider ethical implications. The Medici operated in context where hesitation meant death. If you can afford ethical concerns, you're already advantaged enough that these principles are optional for you, which means you probably won't implement them. And that's fine. The system requires the majority to self-select out through moral discomfort. Now we reach the insight that separates theoretical understanding from practical application. The Medici principles work today precisely because most people can't execute them psychologically. If everyone could implement strategic marriage, leveraged debt architecture, and systematic competitor elimination, the advantages would disappear through commonality. The principles retain power through scarcity of execution. This creates strange dynamic. The information can be freely available because the capacity to act on it isn't distributed equally. You can publish these truths and they remain effectively secret. Not hidden through conspiracy, hidden through distributed inability to implement. Most viewers will extract entertainment value, but zero behavioral change. This isn't failure of the content. It's the filtering mechanism working as designed. The valuable insight isn't what the Medici did. It's why most people who understand what they did still can't replicate it. This understanding reveals the deepest Medici truth. Information asymmetry isn't about secrets anymore. It's about execution capacity asymmetry. In 1400, knowing double-entry bookkeeping was rare. Today, every accounting textbook explains it. The advantage moved from knowing to doing. Most modern businesses understand they should diversify risk, think generationally, and build redundant systems. They don't, because implementation requires tolerating discomfort their leadership can't metabolize. The Medici didn't succeed through superior information. They succeeded through superior psychology. The ability to act on known principles while others hesitated, to maintain strategy across generations while rivals fragmented, to execute unpleasant necessities while competitors sought comfort. This psychological asymmetry is the modern moat. You can give someone the playbook and they still won't execute because execution requires becoming someone different. Most people won't pay that price. We can now answer the question implied by this entire analysis. Can these principles be taught or only recognized in those who already possess the capacity? The Medici trained family members from childhood in financial mechanics, political strategy, and psychological resilience. But Lorenzo's sons still failed. The training wasn't sufficient. This suggests capacity has multiple components. Technical skills transfer readily. The underlying psychology transfers poorly or not at all. You can teach someone to read balance sheets. You can't teach them to maintain strategic vision while bleeding from patsy daggers. That difference determines everything. Some portion of implementation capacity is inherent rather than learned. The question isn't whether you can learn these principles. You just did. The question is whether you possess the psychological substrate to implement them under pressure. That substrate reveals itself only through attempted execution, not before. This leads to uncomfortable conclusion. If capacity is partially inherent, then most people are permanently excluded from upper tiers, regardless of information access. Modern education promises that knowledge creates equality of opportunity. The Medici example suggests otherwise. Equal access to information doesn't produce equal outcomes because implementation capacity isn't equally distributed. This contradicts the fundamental premise of democratic education, which is why this analysis won't appear in curricula. Not because it's secret, because it's incompatible with the system's stated goals. Schools can't acknowledge that they're sorting students into predetermined categories while claiming to provide equal opportunity. The Medici could be explicit about hierarchy because Renaissance Florence didn't pretend otherwise. Modern institutions must maintain the fiction while executing the same sorting function. You're watching this content instead of receiving it in formal education because these truths destabilize necessary social fictions. The practical question remains: given these constraints, what should someone do who recognizes the pattern? First, accept that you're in a minority by merely comprehending this analysis. The fact you're still watching means you haven't self-selected out through moral discomfort or cognitive rejection. Second, implement one principle completely rather than all 10 partially. The Medici power came from integration. But you can't integrate what you haven't mastered individually. Pick the principle that matches your existing psychological capacity. If you naturally think long-term, start there. If you tolerate social isolation well, leverage that. Don't fight your nature. Find where it aligns with Medici principles and amplify that intersection. Third, measure implementation, not understanding. You already understand. Your results over the next decade will reveal whether you possess execution capacity. Most don't. Finding out which category you occupy isn't failure. It's valuable information. The seventh truth deserves expansion because it's most misunderstood. When the Medici systematically destroyed the Patsy family following the assassination attempt, they weren't acting from emotion. They were solving a game theory problem. If conspirators face incomplete punishment, future conspirators face incomplete deterrent. The Medici response needed to be so absolute that the next generation of potential rivals calculated differently. They didn't just punish. They eliminated the category of person who might attempt similar action. This is how minority populations maintain dominance over larger groups. The majority self-restrains because historical precedent established that challenging the minority produces consequences beyond calculation. Modern business calls this sending a message. The Medici sent one so clear it lasted centuries. Contemporary entrepreneurs worry about PR from aggressive legal action. The Medici understood that the appearance of unavoidable consequence prevents challenges from forming. Different operational altitude produces different strategic calculus. Understanding Truth 8 requires examining what Lorenzo meant by strategic invisibility. He didn't advise hiding wealth entirely. That's impossible at scale. He counseled controlling its visibility. The difference is crucial. When wealth displays itself, it attracts attention from tax authorities, competitors, potential kidnappers, and masses who resent inequality. When wealth operates invisibly, while the owner maintains public image of modest means, it moves through society like submarine through ocean. The Medici Palazzo wasn't small, but it wasn't the largest in Florence. Their parties were elegant but not ostentatious. They appeared successful but not obscenely wealthy. Meanwhile, the actual financial network spanned 11 countries and moved capital equivalent to national budgets. The modern equivalent isn't hiding offshore accounts. It's structuring wealth through foundations, trusts, and corporations that separate control from ownership while maintaining operational invisibility. Legal, documented, and completely opaque to casual observation. The compound insight emerges from examining all 10 truths simultaneously. They're not separate strategies. They're facets of single integrated worldview. The Medici saw reality through lens that combined financial mechanics, social dynamics, political power, and multi-generational thinking into unified perception. They didn't switch between business mode and family mode and political mode. It was one continuous strategic game played across all domains simultaneously. This integration is what schools can't teach because curricula segregate knowledge into departments. You take finance in one building, sociology in another, history in a third. The Medici lived the synthesis. When modern education produces specialists who can't see connections between domains, it's not failing. It's succeeding at producing employees rather than operators. The specialist serves the integrator. Always. The ability to see patterns across segregated domains is the actual scarce resource. The Medici had it. Their rivals didn't. That asymmetry explained everything. Now we address the dangerous question. If these principles work, why don't more people implement them? The answer reveals the system's deepest protection mechanism. Implementation requires sacrifices most people won't make because the sacrifices precede the rewards by years or decades. You must accept social isolation before your independence makes it worthwhile. You must delay gratification before compound returns justify the sacrifice. You must develop capacity for absolute response before facing existential threat. The sequence demands faith in principles that haven't yet produced results. Most people need evidence before commitment. The Medici committed before evidence appeared. That's not courage. It's different relationship to uncertainty. Risk-seeking versus risk-averse isn't personality trait you can change. It's neurological substrate that determines which strategies you can actually execute. The system protects itself by requiring upfront costs that most psychological profiles can't pay. This isn't conspiracy. It's elegant evolutionary filtering. The meta-lesson requires examining your own response to this content. If you're feeling inspired and motivated, you've probably missed the point. This isn't motivational content. It's descriptive analysis of filtering mechanisms. The Medici succeeded because they possessed psychological substrate that most lack. Inspiration is what average people need, because they're attempting behaviors outside their natural capacity. The actual operators don't feel inspired, they feel recognized. There's a difference. Inspiration suggests you need external energy to attempt difficult action. Recognition suggests you're discovering articulation of patterns you already sensed. If these principles resonate as new information you must force yourself to implement, the forcing is the problem. The Medici didn't force themselves to think strategically or tolerate isolation or execute absolute responses. Those behaviors emerged naturally from who they were. You can't force yourself into different psychological category any more than you can force different height. You can optimize within your category, but the category itself is largely fixed. This reveals why the content simultaneously attracts and repels viewers. Those who possess relevant substrate feel compelled to continue despite discomfort. Those who lack it feel growing aversion despite intellectual interest. The aversion isn't moral objection, it's psychological immune response to information suggesting they're permanently outside certain categories. Most people need to believe that effort and education create equality of potential outcome. Content suggesting otherwise triggers defensive reactions stronger than response to moral offenses. You can tell someone their behavior is unethical, and they'll debate. Tell them their psychological category is fixed, and they'll reject the framework entirely. This reaction is the filter operating in real time. The Medici wouldn't have cared whether rivals rejected their framework. They'd note the rejection as confirmation of categorical difference. Modern therapeutic culture treats this recognition as harmful. Renaissance culture treated it as accurate. Different premises about human malleability produce different strategic behaviors. Neither premise is provably true, but one enables clearer strategic thinking. We're now approaching content conclusion, which means addressing implementation for the minorities still watching. You've self-selected through 28 scenes of increasingly uncomfortable analysis. That itself provides information about your psychological substrate. But persistence doesn't guarantee capacity. Some viewers remain through morbid fascination rather than recognition. The distinction matters. If you're watching to learn what the elite do, you're outside the category. If you're watching because this articulates patterns you already implemented without framework, you might be inside it, the test. Have you already structured financial decisions for multi-generational benefit? Already accepted social isolation as cost of independent thinking? Already demonstrated capacity for absolute response when threatened? If no, you're consuming content about a game you're not playing. If yes, this analysis provides language for something you already understood experientially. Either category is fine, but confusing them wastes time. The former can work for the latter. The latter can't become the former through information consumption. The ninth truth about restoration after collapse deserves final expansion. When the Medici returned from exile, they didn't rebuild from zero, they activated dormant networks. This reveals the ultimate truth about power. It's relational architecture that survives institutional collapse. Your bank can fail, your company can dissolve, your property can be confiscated. If your power derived purely from those institutions, you're finished. But if you built genuine relationships that transcended institutional affiliation, those relationships can reconstruct institutional power. The Medici spent decades making themselves necessary to cardinals, nobles, merchants across Europe. When their Florence-based bank collapsed, the relationship infrastructure survived. Modern operators confuse net worth with power because contemporary context rarely tests the difference. When it does, market crash, political upheaval, industry disruption, the difference becomes catastrophically obvious. Those with only financial capital get destroyed. Those with relational capital reconstruct, build both, but know which is foundation and which is superstructure. The final implementation insight concerns timing. The Medici principles work differently depending on context. In stable times, strategic invisibility dominates. During crisis, capacity for absolute response matters most. In growth periods, leverage becomes critical. In consolidation phases, generational thinking produces advantage. Most operators use same strategies regardless of context, which is why they succeed sometimes and fail others. The Medici modulated strategy based on environmental reading. This requires meta-level awareness most never develop. You must simultaneously play the game and monitor which game is currently active. The majority can do one or the other. Strategy under pressure or strategic adaptation to changing context. Not both. That's why hiring consultants became industry, outsourcing the meta-level awareness their operators lack. But consultants provide analysis, not execution capacity. The Medici family embodied both. That integration remains the rarest quality. If you possess it, you don't need this content. If you don't, this content can't give it to you. We must address the elephant. Is this just historical analysis or prescription for action? Both and neither. The Medici principles describe mechanisms that operate whether you approve or not. Gravity doesn't require your belief to function. These social and economic forces work regardless of your moral stance. But prescription suggests everyone should implement these approaches. That's false. Most can't. The few who can don't need permission or instruction. They need articulation of patterns they already sensed. This content serves three audiences. First, operators who recognize these patterns from experience gain language to systematize intuitive knowledge. Second, intelligent observers understand elite behavior previously seeming arbitrary or evil. Third, everyone else gets entertainment before returning to comfortable ignorance. All three outcomes are valid. The mistake is audience 1 thinking they're audience 2, or audience 2 believing they could become audience 1 through information. Your category determines how you process this content. The content doesn't determine your category. The practical question for audience 1: what single action tonight would indicate genuine implementation versus theoretical interest? The Medici answer: implement the principle that costs you something today. If you're serious about strategic invisibility, delete the social media flex you were about to post. If you mean generational thinking, move money from vacation fund to investment account your children will access. If you understand absolute response, have the difficult conversation you've been avoiding. Small implementations reveal psychological substrate better than grand plans. Most people plan elaborately and execute minimally. The ratio is diagnostic. The Medici didn't plan the bank for years before starting. Giovanni opened it and adjusted based on feedback. Modern culture valorizes planning over execution because planning feels productive without risk. Renaissance culture valorized execution because results came from action, not intention. If you finished this content and do nothing differently tonight, you were audience 3 pretending to be audience 1. That's fine. Just be honest about which game you're playing. Before conclusion, we must examine why this analysis itself exists. Why would anyone articulate filtering mechanisms if articulation helps people game them? The answer reveals final layer. Articulating the filter doesn't disable it because the filter operates at psychological level beneath conscious manipulation. You can know the Medici succeeded through tolerance for isolation. That knowledge doesn't make isolation more tolerable. You can understand they thought generationally. That understanding doesn't extend your time preference. The gap between intellectual knowledge and embodied capacity is the actual filter. This entire analysis could be taught in schools, and it wouldn't change distribution of outcomes because distribution derives from substrate variation, not information access. The truly dangerous idea isn't that elites use these principles. It's that most people can't implement them even with complete transparency. That reality threatens the foundation of democratic education more than any specific elite practice, which is why this remains outside curricula despite being documentable historical fact. The conclusion must acknowledge uncertainty. Everything stated here might be wrong. The Medici might have succeeded through luck rather than strategy. Psychological substrate might be more malleable than presented. Distribution of capacity might be more equal than suggested. These are possibilities, but centuries of documented outcomes suggest patterns, not proof, patterns. The Medici approach worked for them. Similar approaches worked for Rothschilds, Rockefellers, and every family that maintained wealth across generations. Different execution, same underlying principles. That consistency across time and geography suggests something systematic rather than random. You must decide whether the pattern is real or whether you're seeing order in chaos. Both interpretations are defensible, but only one orientation produces strategic clarity. The Medici chose to assume patterns were real and acted accordingly. Their rivals assumed the opposite. History documented which assumptions produced better outcomes. That's not proof the Medici were right. It's evidence their framework generated superior results. Truth 9 destroyed more fortunes than market crashes. The Medici Bank collapsed in 1494, 60 years after reaching peak dominance. Not from bad loans or failed ventures, from Lorenzo's sons lacking the capacity to maintain what their ancestors built. Piero the Unfortunate surrendered Florence to French invasion without resistance. The family fortune evaporated within a generation of Lorenzo's death. Schools don't teach this part. They show Renaissance glory, not the statistical reality. 90% of fortunes die with their creators' grandchildren. The Medici proved the rule despite seeming to transcend it. Wealth preservation requires not just accumulation, but transfer of the psychologies that generated it. Most inheritors receive assets without the scarcity mindset that built them. Abundance as birthright produces different neural patterns than abundance as achievement. The first destroys what the second created, the final truth. You've reached the end of this analysis, which means you're in the statistical minority that persisted through uncomfortable material. That fact tells you something. Not everything, but something. The question isn't whether you can implement Medici principles. The question is whether you already are. And this content merely provided language for existing patterns. If you are, you recognize the framework immediately and extracted value from articulation. If you aren't, you feel vaguely unsettled and aren't sure why. That distinction matters more than any specific principle discussed. The Medici built the Renaissance through understanding patterns most couldn't see. You're watching content about those patterns on a device they couldn't imagine. But the underlying principles haven't changed. Power still flows through leverage, information, networks, and psychological substrate, whether you possess the substrate to engage with power rather than serve. It is something this content can't determine. Only your next decade of decisions will reveal that answer. The analysis ends here. The test continues.